Hello everyone, Just Nuke It here, and today we'll dive into the meaning of Braid. So I imagine most people were utterly confused on what just happened after finishing Braid. There were books, princesses, rewinding, and monkeys with metal sticking out of their heads. So to break it all down, I'm going to address the most commonly accepted explanation of Braid's story, the developer's take on the story and ending, and then I'm going to dive into the story, the ending, and what the epilogue means. Let's get started with the most agreed upon explanation of the ending. So the third book in the epilogue talks about Tim hiding in a bunker in a desert after tinkering with something the night before in order to find the princess. It also includes two famous quotes. The first one, "On that moment hung eternity," is a quote from a 1945 New York Times article written by William L. Lawrence after he witnessed the Trinity nuclear bomb test in New Mexico. The second quote, "Now we are all sons of bitches," was a response to J. Robert Oppenheimer, one of the physicists in the Manhattan Project, by the director of the Trinity nuclear test, Kenneth Bainbridge. Apparently, Bainbridge made the remark moments after the bomb detonated. On top of that, the hidden text for the same book talks about a she that stood tall and majestic and radiated fury. So if you can't guess by now, the book seems to be implying that Tim's princess was actually the atomic bomb. This also indicates that Tom was a scientist in the Manhattan Project who was obsessed with his quest to find the princess, which actually was his desire to create the A-bomb. And since the final level is actually World 1, the rest of the game is Tim trying to put his life back together in a metaphorical sense. This theory is further supported by the last two books in World 1, which is actually technically the last world. In the first one, it mentions that if Tim finds a princess, it would spark an intense light that would embrace the world. And the final book mentions that this light would be destructive, destroying all hope of safety forever. But the most compelling evidence is the alternate ending. And if you don't want any spoilers, then why are you watching an explanation video on the ending of Braid? So there are 8 stars that are hidden throughout the game. After collecting 7 of them, 2 of the levers in the final level become green. This allows Tim to actually reach the princess during the final moments of the level, and what happens is unexpected. So after the extreme difficulty of getting all the stars, you are rewarded with an exploding princess. Seems like the atomic bomb explanation is pretty cut and dry, right? Except for one thing, or should I say one person, Jonathan Blow. During a commentary session at Nottingham's Game City Festival in 2010, as reported by Digital Spy, he was asked about the William Lawrence quote, and I'm assuming since the article doesn't include the question, if the story was about the atomic bomb. His response, "I'm not really talking that much about the story, but that quote is most certainly in there. It's something to take into account when reading the text. But how does it come into the actual story? It's a very tightly focused game. I spent 3 years working on the details. Nothing in this game is there by accident, and that includes all the story pieces. But that's all of them, right? So I feel when someone takes one of them and decides to say, this is what the game is all about, they're sort of neglecting a lot of the other ones, which I would not recommend. And I felt the same way when I heard about the atomic bomb conclusion. That one book that contains the direct references to the atomic bomb makes up about 1% of the overall text in the game. Throw in the last 2 books from World 1, and the overall narrative barely points to the bomb. So where do we go then? Is the game open to interpretation? Well, I think any art form is open to others' opinions. That's why museums constantly have patrons come through their doors, and professors write novels about individual works of art. However, when Blow was asked about Braid's story being open to interpretation, this is how he responded. "The game means something very definite to me. It's not a linear story kind of thing. It's an unverbalizable concept kind of thing, and those story elements contribute very heavily to that." Obviously, Blow had a specific message he was trying to convey, and according to the interviews that he did and comments that he's made, the puzzles don't stop at the gameplay. They translate to the story too. And what is the solution? Fuck if I know. No, seriously. Every quote that I read from Blow seemed like a stream of consciousness that sometimes branched off into intangible tangents. which is fine because I would probably sound the same way in an interview, especially if I was talking about something I'm passionate about. However, stream of consciousness quotes makes it next to impossible to extract any concrete clues into what Blow was shooting for in terms of the overall story or message. So I'm going to do what I think most people have done so far, come up with my own assumptions and try to back them up with some evidence. To start off, I'm going to focus on the structure of the text and how it was presented. At the beginning of the game, in World 2, the player is tricked into believing that the writing style is possibly Tim's consciousness or a telling of his backstory. The first book reads, Tim is off on a search to rescue the princess. She has been snatched by a horrible and evil monster. This happened because Tim made a mistake. So given what we know from the ending, we know that Tim is the real monster. The book goes the extra mile of calling the monster horrible and evil. Redundant adjectives are often used by someone who is trying to emotionally hammer in a point, but can also seem overbearing. Think of someone who's getting screwed over by an organization. If that someone goes on a rant about their situation, you can expect exaggerated depictions of the organization and the people who run it. The CEO is a cotton-picking, boot-licking, mother-licking, baby-kicking, Hitler-loving asshole. Despite the fact that the CEO is probably an ass, the adjectives are just piled on in hopes that the audience of this rant will feel for them. Now imagine Tim reading that quote in the first book, especially the second sentence. She was snatched by a horrible and evil monster. Oh no, horrible and evil? It appears that Tim is trying to paint someone else, like the knight at the end of the game, as the bad guy. Now I'm not sure if Tim is the narrator, but I believe it is some sort of unreliable narration, similar to The Unusual Suspects or A Beautiful Mind. The text in each world paints Tim as someone overcoming immense internal struggles. However, it is framed as if Tim just needs to think his way out of his conundrum and all will be well. This goes along, in my opinion, with Blow mentioning philosophy eventually evolving into science. Basically, it moves away from the questions and ideas of early philosophy and makes them into hard solutions through science. And this is what each world represents. Tim's mental solution in solving his conundrum spelled out in the books for that particular world. But unlike normal dreams or fantasies, Tim actually uses hard logic and science in these philosophical worlds. This creates physical laws that he must overcome to put the pieces back together in order to solve his dilemma. With that said, we have to remember that the narrator is a liar, or is Tim's consciousness trying to ignore the fact that Tim is actually the monster. Problems do not just go away by coming up with a solution after the fact. Like in World 2, where it's suggested that taking something back will make everything okay. It is a nice thought, but unfortunately the real world does not work like that. And this reality becomes apparent in playing through World 1. Despite the fact that Tim was able to mentally solve his individual problems and create a world that turns back the hands of time, it ultimately does not fix his mistakes. The reality still remains that Tim is a monster, which is represented by removing all the time manipulation control from the player, except for watching yourself play through your mistakes in real time. And finally, in the epilogue, the false narrator begins to be challenged. At this point, there are two versions of each book. The very first passage begins with a boy and a girl, where the boy is portrayed as the protector. But when you hide Tim from view, the text changes to be from the girl's perspective and describes the boy as obsessive and overbearing. To me, the hidden text represents either what Tim ultimately misses in solving his problems, or what he tries to hide from the audience and himself. This duality continues with the next three books, where they describe Tim's obsession of finding the princess and what he's unable to see or understand. Either Tim is unable to see the princess in front of him despite trying everything, or his misunderstanding of the power of the atomic bomb, or even his lack of comprehension as a child of why he cannot have the things at the candy store. Accordingly, it's pretty safe to assume the princess is a metaphor even before we get to the final level. I've been unable to figure out what she truly represents, or if she's supposed to represent something specifically or in general. But to me, she represents the answer that both philosophers and scientists seek and are unable to obtain since the universe is beyond their comprehension. Sometimes they make a discovery, but all that does is raise more questions and possibly makes them realize how little they actually know or comprehend. Blow describes the epilogue as a world falling apart. I believe this is to represent Tim's own personal perception of the universe falling apart around him, as he begins to realize his own shortcomings and lack of knowledge. Every philosopher and scientist goes through a process from time to time, where they realize what they held true was indeed false. How they react to this realization determines how they will proceed in the future. For Tim, it appears he tries to put the pieces of his life back together and create a new foundation to form new ideas and hypotheses. But you have to remember, World 1 and the Epilogue are actually the beginning of the game, and World 2 and beyond contains the false narratives that continue to be presented to the audience. So what does it all mean? Every time a new discovery or new realization develops, scientists and philosophers start to rationalize their shortcomings as something that is expected and fail to realize that they're repeating the same mistakes that they made before. And when they make that new discovery, like the last book of Book 1 says, the light would be intense and warm at the beginning, but then flicker down to nothing, taking the castle with it. It would be like burning down the place that we've always called home, where we played so innocently as children, destroying all hope of safety forever. I think that is the meaning of Braid, the scientific process of discovery, creation of laws, self-assurance of the universe, followed by the crushing realization of being wrong and having to start over again. And what is the meaning of the stars and the exploding princess in the alternate ending? I believe that is a reflection on the player and how they are a prisoner of the same system. To obtain all the stars, the player has to completely master the mechanics of each world and obsessively search each level for the solution. In World 2, to get the star, there is a cloud that takes 2 hours to travel across the level, and the player has to wait the entire time to obtain it. And after all that hard work of getting 7 stars and finally attaining a way to get our version of the princess, it literally blows up in her face. But like I said before, I can be completely off. But like any philosopher, I'm going to stick to my guns and evidence until the crushing weight of reality comes down on me. I cannot say I understood all of this. Possibly I'm more confused now than ever. But all these moments I contemplated. Something has occurred. The moment feels substantial in my mind, like stones. Kneeling, reaching down towards the closest one, running my hand across it. I find it smooth and slightly cold. I test the stone's weight and I find I can lift it. And the others too. I can fit them together to create a foundation, an embankment, a castle. To build a castle of appropriate size, I will need a great many stones. But what I got now feels like an acceptable start. Hope you all enjoyed my explanation and see you in the next video. Bye.